This is always, in a way, the hard part. You know, I love hearing everybody chatting and reconnecting and networking and all that. And then I have to cut you off. So I'm the parent that you don't want to have around. I'm going to make a brief announcement about the tour this afternoon, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker. So the post office / courthouse tours start at 5. You're welcome to walk over, be there right at 5 o'clock. The tours will be staggered, so at 15-minute intervals. And the last one will start at 5:45. So if you show up after that, you lose track of time, don't get there until closer to 6, you're out of luck. It's a big building. There are going to be multiple groups that will be able to go around with different leaders. And so I think we can accommodate everybody that wants to go, but that's why we're starting at staggered times. And you can gather on what's called the Jackson Street side of the building, which is the short end of it as you're walking from here. And I think you'll be able to figure it out. You'll probably see a lot of people anyway. So that's the news about the tour. Onward to the keynote address. This is really fun for me, partly because I was thinking back to previous years' conferences and keynote speakers, and I couldn't remember someone who we had invited to come in who has a connection from another outside state organization, but also represents Minnesota in a different way. So that's what's fun about introducing Bonnie McDonald, who's also a dear, dear old friend, and it's wonderful to have her back in Minnesota again. Bonnie is the president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois. She has been there since 2012, where she advances the vision, mission, and programs of Illinois' only statewide preservation nonprofit organization. What's more important about that is that Bonnie's transformative thinking about preservation in the last several years has led Landmarks Illinois to focus its work on people and their important connection to historic places, something that we don't always focus on because we're always thinking about that building or that cultural landscape. She is currently spearheading the organization's evolution to enhance its relevance and to create a national model for justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity in preservation practice, something that we've all been thinking a lot more about in the last several years. From 2018 to 2021, Bonnie served as board chair of the National Preservation Partners Network, and she is proud to have been awarded the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation Mid-Career Fellowship 3 years ago in 2020 to write a guidebook, and we will hear more about this, a guidebook to relevancy in the preservation movement. Former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot appointed Bonnie co-chair of the Chicago Monuments Project in 2020 to help lead a truth and racial reckoning process in the city around problematic artworks. Bonnie was raised in Minnesota, as I said, and I'll let you guess where she's from, or she can tell us. And she served as the executive director of the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, now known as RETHOS, from 2005 to 2012. So we are really delighted to have our native Minnesotan come back home to us all the way from Chicago and welcome her. So please join me in giving a round of welcome applause to Bonnie.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Are you enjoying the conference so far? Yeah. I'll tell you, Illinois does not have a conference, so be happy that you have one, and we'll probably show up as interlopers at some point. I am so very honored to be here in Minnesota because you all understand my accent, which is something that doesn't happen in Illinois. I have to, where are you from? Scandinavia? Nope. South Canada. And then they say, oh, okay. So I am truly honored and it is a privilege to be with you today to talk about what has become a passion project for me and my team at Landmarks Illinois, and that is to talk about how we can help preservation become more meaningful to more people. And I think we all want to see more people see the value of what we believe in, what we do, but also how do we become more aware and better listeners about the people with whom we're working to understand why places are important to them as well. So today there are 4 topics that I'd like to review, I'd like to discuss with you. I hope to leave quite a bit of time at the end for a question and answer period so that we have a robust amount of discussion. And then afterward, I'd love to hear from you. I have my contact information at the very end as well. So those 4 areas include number 1, preservation's relevancy crisis, a provocative term, but I'm going to lay out why I do think our field is in a crisis moment and why we're at the inflection point where we need to make change and why. And then the second is, how do we make that change? What are ideas that are coming forward from the field to advance new ideas about preservation that are actually going to make it more meaningful to people? And third, something just to plant a seed for you, where I hope we can do research in the future about something called people's right to place. And how place is actually something that is endemically something we have a right to. So I'll end by asking you all to make a commitment based on what you find today and more information that's coming forward in the future about an action you feel comfortable taking to enhance the relevance of preservation in your own community, in your own field, in your own job, or about the places that you love and the people that you work with. So let's start with preservation's relevancy crisis. And I'm going to ask some questions of you to gauge how are you doing in Minnesota and how does it compare to Illinois? And I hope you're doing a lot better than us. So, all right, anybody recognize does this feel familiar when you see you're at a city council meeting, the city council doesn't get it? They just don't understand why a place is important, why we should forward preservation. How many have had this experience where you're standing at the dais trying to explain why a building is important? Raise your hand. Carolyn Sundquist, you raise your hand. I know you've been there in Duluth. All right. How many of you have tried to explain why you need a preservation ordinance? All right. Ooh, you're doing better. Thank you, Heidi. I'm sure you've had many of these. How many of you have not had enough funding to do the work that you would like to do? How many of you have had a recalcitrant property owner who does not understand why their place is important? Well, that's the most popular one so far. Okay. Maybe some of you Main Street folks in here, how many have had a property owner you just don't know they're there? There's just vacant, you don't know where they are. All right. So here we are. We don't have enough political support at times. This is not a panacea. There are some communities that do get it. So I just want to say we've made progress from when preservation started in some ways in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act. We're not without successes. So I just want to say, I want to recognize that we have a lot of good things under our belt. But this is happening far too often. So in our community, in Illinois, all across the state, we have city councils that are trying to get rid of their preservation ordinances, that are trying to diminish the value of preservation ordinances as a tool, that are reducing funding, the funding tools that we have that are, in 2007, we almost lost the federal historic tax credit. We have National Register places that are proposed for demolition. That's what I'm showing you here. This is the city of Evanston, Illinois. It's a suburb of Chicago in the north. And our organization, Landmarks Illinois, joined the local advocates to try to save a National Register listed building, but also a local landmark owned by the city of Evanston, trying to tear down its own landmark. Does anybody see a problem with this? So why are we standing here? Why are we at that dais still trying to explain to a city government why their own landmark is important in a community? Now, thankfully, we had a wonderful group of advocates who came to the table with us who made the case to their local elected officials. But I can tell you this keeps happening. We keep losing ordinances, we keep losing incentives, we have owners fighting us. That is just to say that we're now 50 plus years past the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. That's why I think we're in a crisis moment, is that we still are facing these challenges. So it is a time when we need preservation to matter to more people, because our nation is changing, thankfully. It's continuing to change. Our nation is diversifying. The kinds of stories that we want to tell and want to connect with people are changing, and preservation is not necessarily keeping up. We're not doing a great job of being able to tell more stories, of having the funds that people need, of having more tools outside of those existing regulatory tools that we keep going back to, the National Register, the National Historic Landmark System, federal historic tax credits. As I was talking with, I'm going to call out Erin Hannaford-Berg, there are 90% of places that don't qualify for these tools that we still want to help, that we still want to provide support. So I'm saying we need to change in order to be meaningful and relevant to people in the future, so that this work is still here 50 years from now to provide support to people who have places that they care about. Isn't that why we do this work? Is to make sure that the stories are still there, that we can tell the people about how we came to be who we are. So what is relevance? It's become a buzzword now, but I just want to say in the definition of the Relevancy Project, as I'll tell you about, that something is relevant to a person when they connect with it, when it relates to something in their life, and when they care about it. We are all in this room right now because we care about preservation. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. So we connect to it. It's important to us. We care about these places, and we see them as relating to our life, but not everybody does. So I think this is getting into part 2. Why places matter to more people. Notwithstanding HGTV, which is doing a great job of getting us to paint everything gray, and rip down every building, right? Just take a sledgehammer to that thing and it'll be great. But what about the places that don't fall into that category? In hometown, for example. Not every place is seen as relevant. So as I mentioned, the case of Evanston was essentially something we kept seeing over and over again in Illinois, and we were just asking ourselves, what does this mean? And were people elsewhere in the country seeing the same things that we were? So we decided we needed to go out and talk with people all across the country and ask this question: was this just Illinois, where we were seeing this constant barrage of anti-preservation sentiment, or was this elsewhere in the country? And if it was around the country, what could we do about it? So our organization and me as spearheading this launched the Relevancy Project, the worst name for a project ever, I can just tell you, because it's really, you could find the Relevancy Project in every humanities work out there. But what it is trying to find out what is the tone of preservation all across the country. Over the past 4 years, I've been able to spend time talking with 130 people in preservation field, in every kind of preservation field, SHPOs, CLGs, preservation advocacy organizations, consulting firms, tribal historic preservation officers, the National Park Service, trying to ensure that we had a cross-section of people in our field as well as those outside, because we need to hear what other people think about preservation from outside our field as well. So I'd like to thank 2 people in the room especially who took the time to talk with me. Number one is Cheyenne St. John. Is Cheyenne in the room? So our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from the Lower Indian Sioux Reservation, and Heidi Swank, who at the time was in Nevada, but she's now here. They were 2 of the people that I spoke with about their feelings about preservation. After that time, I've been doing research to add more to the list of ideas that we have about what to do. What I heard from everybody was that we just don't know what to do. We know there's a problem, but how do you move forward? What are the actions that I can take? We are all so busy in our jobs, you don't have time to really think for days and days about what the actions are that you can take. So that is something we put together, and I'll talk about in just a moment with you. So there were a series of blog posts that were put forward from our website about the areas of opportunity that I'll mention. So there's more information out there that you can find right now. And furthermore, we'll be publishing a guidebook, as Mike mentioned, the guidebook to relevance. So I just want to say that there were common themes that came out of this that are resonating all across the field. Number one is it's a provocative statement, and I'm here to talk about this with you. It's something that I coined the culture of preciousness. And that is that preservation looks more at the material, and we put more weight on the material than the significance of the building. And that is that we have the integrity standard, which guides us on whether a property is or is not historic. We have a yes or a no system on this. Even though there are 7 factors of integrity in the National Register system, there are some that have more weight, it seems, to the way that we evaluate. So this is the Sheldon Peck House. It's just an example for you. This is an 1839 building in a suburb of Chicago, Lombard, and it's associated with an itinerant painter, Sheldon Peck. Even more important, it was a stop on the Underground Railroad and is part of the Network to Freedom Trail. It has been proposed for National Register listing and denied over and over and over again, 3 times. And that is because there have been too many alterations over time. This is a question about, don't those alterations actually add to its story? Isn't it saying more about the people who lived there over time? Can't we have a national register that might see the continuity of history and not have a period of significance? That it tells a much broader story. Here, I also named it the Sheldon Peck Homestead. Where's Sheldon Peck's wife? Her name isn't even in here. Harriet Peck as well. If you go back to many of our National Register listings, it's only a man's name. And that's because men tend to be those that we recognize as the most significant in our history. And I'll talk about the statistic in just a moment about that. But the rationale here is that there are too many alterations over time, and until you restore it back to its period of significance, it is not historic. So I think that is a problem when we put the material above the significance of the story. And because it makes that building not eligible for some of our grant programs, it makes it harder for them because they're not eligible for Section 106 review, for MIRA in this state as well. So if you say, well, this is off, this is the job of preservation. We are here to save the material. I want to go back to the basics, go back to the history of preservation. So this, with Heritage So Rich, have any of you heard of this report? All right, oh, this is good, And most of the time, no one's ever heard of this. So thank you, Minnesota, always leading the charge. Here's a quote from it, which I think surprises many people. If you're reading it, it says that preservation cannot be the cult of antiquarians, that we have to go beyond saving the bricks and mortar, that we must provide an orientation to society. So even in 1966, this is the origin of the National Historic Preservation Act. It was a report put out by the National Conference of Mayors after they realized urban renewal was destroying many of our central cities, our historic cities. They went to Europe and studied what Europe was doing after World War II, after the bombing of many cities in Europe, and discovered that the role of historic properties is to provide orientations of society, but we can't treat them like revered shrines. They are places that are living and breathing, and they have continued stories, and places need to serve people as well. So this goes back to the basics of who we are and what we do. And I'd say that we're missing entire portions of history. You might have heard the statistic, I'll just cite it again, that as of fiscal year 2014, the National Park Service did a study and found that only 8% of the National Register listings were representative of the stories of women, people of color, and the LGBTQ community combined. That's 51% of the population that identifies as women. That's 40% of the nation that reflects themselves, identifies as a person of color, and 13% that identify as LGBTQAI+. We're missing those stories because we've tended to tell one story in our National Register up to this point, and it's the story of men, the Gilded Age, Victorian architecture. architecture, periods of significance, history, style, and that's what we were taught. Our reviewers were taught this. I bring this up just to say this is one of the few. This is the Henry Gerber House, and you might be asking, why did I put this up here? This is one of the few National Historic Landmarks associated with the LGBTQAI+ community. This was the first location of an organization that was chartered for LGBTQ rights in 1924. The Society for Human Rights, which was created here by Henry Gerber, and he was arrested for his activities, for publishing a newsletter about the rights of people, the rights for people to love whomever they want to love and to be whoever they are. So this is a National Register, local landmark, and National Historic Landmark, but again, we only have 8% that represents this, people of color and women combined. I also would say what we found, this is the collective, 130 people have said, this is what we're worried about, so this is not just one point of view, that we also are concerned how we tell the story of history. Because this is the Henry B. Clark House, again, missing Caroline Clark, his wife who actually ran this home after Henry Clark died, almost immediately after they built this house. This is the oldest, or known as the oldest house in Chicago. And it is interpreted as basically an early 1830s place as you walk through it, the period furniture that was put in by the colonial dames, not recognizing that actually the longest owners of this was the Church of God in Christ. And Bishop Henry Lewis Ford and his wife Margaret and their congregation, the Church of God in Christ, there's a photo of them on the right for you, were the caretakers of this property from 1941 to 1970. They had it longer than the Clarks did, and their name was not on this at all. There's about 3 sentences in the National Register nomination about their history in this. Just to say, we tell one story. Thankfully, there's been an advocacy effort to go back and ensure that the Fords and the Church of God in Christ story is told, and the home has now been renamed, very long name, the Henry B. and Caroline Clark House and the Bishop Lewis Henry Ford and Margaret Ford House, because that's historic preservationist too. We just colloquially call it the Clark Ford House now. So just to say, if you're questioning, you're saying, this is just a minority. This is a small group of people who thinks these are problems of preservation. I just want to say it is not. So it's not only those 130 people that I had the privilege of speaking with, it is thousands of us. So there have been 2 studies done, one in 2019, one in 2022, surveying the preservation field, and this keeps coming out that the vast majority of preservationists want change, see that we need to change this field. In fact, in this case, I think it was 92% in this preservation and change survey that was done by the University of Pennsylvania. And here are the 4 findings I just want you to continue to take in as I'm going through the presentation today, is that much in this room, I'm sure some of you are saying everything's fine. I'm sure some of you say we've done things well. I'm sure some say we've done everything wrong. There's everything in between. And it's because there are deep divides in our field about what we think the future is going to be. There's this intersection and there's no consensus around how we are going to move forward. It's very uncomfortable. And at this moment, because we don't have clarity, we're moving around with great uncertainty. So I think what's important, thank you for giving me this platform, because we just have to talk about it. We need to have the opportunity to hear each other and listen to each other and work together collaboratively to try to move forward with what a new preservation program could be. We disagree on how to change, as I mentioned, and that we know preservation does not reflect the nation's diversity as well. So how do we change this? I think it's important, yes, we've talked about it. In fact, there have been presentations like this, everybody, since 1991. When the National Historic Preservation Act turned 25, we've been talking about the relevance of preservation, and we haven't really seen change. Because, as we keep hearing, people don't know what to do. We're so overburdened in our work already that we're not sure what steps to take. So here are the opportunity areas that came forward from these interviews. There are 8 that we see predominantly as places where we can be more relevant to more people. So I'm going to touch on these. This is incredibly brief. I apologize. Hopefully we can continue to deepen the conversation after the guidebook is out, on social media, in town halls that we will have. But I wanted to introduce you to them to the best of my ability. So first is really that culture of preciousness, just to say that material is more important than people. This is the Bailey House, and it is, once again, I don't like to start out preservation, but you all understand why this is important. This is designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is Illinois. Everything is Frank Lloyd Wright or Abraham Lincoln. So just want to say, either they looked at it or slept there. It's important. This is in Hinsdale, suburb of Chicago, and it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1894. If any of you are Wright files, you know that's the first year he started his practice. This is one of his first designs. And it went up for sale. Hinsdale is a tear-down capital. Basically, any property that's put up for sale that's older than about 10 years gets torn down. They build a new home. So this was put on the sale as a tear-down. And there was thankfully a couple in Cincinnati after Landmarks, Illinois, and our partners at the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy came forward to advocate for finding a new owner for it. New owners came in, bought it, yay, saved. And they tried to put it on the National Register to use one of the incentives we have in Illinois, which is a tax assessment freeze, and they were denied. Denied National Register listing because it has aluminum siding on the exterior. I mean, how much more of a pedigree do you need? It's a Frank Lloyd Wright building, the first of its kind, and this still can't get on the National Register until they remove the siding off of it. And you can't get money to remove the siding until you remove the siding. Culture of preciousness. So we can continue to talk about what I mean by that, but it's just that the material is all, the significance is wrapped up in the material. And it's essentially saying no one can understand why this is important until the aluminum siding comes off of it. I think people are smarter than that. They can figure it out. The second is that we must continue to tell stories that are about everyone's history. I mean, our National Register is telling one general story about, the founding narrative of the United States, about, the Gilded Age, about the importance of capitalism, and we're missing the stories of immigration in many ways. This is not a panacea, but immigration, family, dance, art, history, culture, LGBTQ status, as I mentioned. And so, building a more relevant preservation movement is about building a movement that tells everyone's story. Yes, we agree as a field overwhelmingly that we want to tell the full history, but we need to make pathways so that that's actually possible. Right now, as I just mentioned, it's so difficult to get something on the National Register if you've made any changes to it. And in many communities, they've maintained properties, but those maintenance is seen as actually diminishing the integrity of the property. Now imagine if you've maintained a property over time and you're told it actually is not significant. This property is insignificant because you've maintained it, but you've done it poorly, you've done it wrong. It's very offensive to people when you say that. Similarly, if we want to build an inclusive movement, inclusion is actually about creating a welcoming environment. It's not just inviting people in, it's about making a space people want to be, where they feel they belong, where they see themselves. You can't be it until you see it. And that is about making sure that the stories being told are self-determined by a community too. What do they feel is important? I don't want to use they and us, but in this case, a community deciding what they feel is important. So this one is just an example. This is Arco de la Valita, and it's the Little Village Arch, and not identified in a survey, by the way, because it was built in 1991, very recent, but it is the gateway to Little Village, which is a predominant Mexican-American community, seen as tremendously important monument, landmark to the arrival of this community in Chicago. This is one of our newest local landmarks. Even though it's 1991, it's one of the newest local landmarks because the community brought it forward as something important. And then we've continued to provide service as requested about how to preserve it, what tools are out there, what resources exist. So self-determination is also tremendously important to creating an inclusive preservation movement. Also, walking our talk. So it was mentioned, thank you, Mike, during my introduction, that I was honored, privileged, and also I don't know what I did wrong to deserve being the co-chair of the Chicago Monuments Project, but it was also a tremendously difficult 2 years talking about the future of monuments. You may think of Confederate monuments and the conversation around that. Of course, in St. Paul, there was the removal of the Christopher Columbus monument. we have this discussion in Chicago about over 500 monuments. 40 were determined to be problematic, and this was one of them. So again, can you imagine Abraham Lincoln being mentioned as problematic? Lindsay probably can, knows what I'm talking about. In Illinois, but it is because people are not always aware of all of the history of the heroes that have been put before them. That in addition to being the great emancipator, Lincoln also perpetrated horrors against Native American people in this country through the Indian policies that his administration put forward. In this very city that we are standing in right now was the largest mass extinction, mass execution of 38 Dakota warriors, 38 Dakota men who were killed, who were hung for protecting their people. People don't know that history. Many outside of Minnesota never heard that. And once hearing it, I think they had a greater understanding that people, our heroes are people too. And that they're not always, I don't think we want to restart that right now. Or maybe you do. So it's also about standing up. So standing up and saying that even though this is a local landmark, National Register listed, that this may not be the thing we want in public space. We may not want this monument to be in public space because it's not seen as actually truthful. It's not telling the true history. And as preservationists, that was a really hard position to take, but the right position to take, removing monuments. And now I can't advance. So we're just going to talk about Lincoln for the next hour and a half. Thanks. But in addition to that, thank you. Appreciate that. Opportunities. Opportunities around affordable housing. So affordable housing is actually one of the places in our nation where we agree the most. It's interesting because a majority of people see the lack of housing affordability in their communities, and this is by the way rural, suburban, and urban. So I just want to reflect that in this community today, I'm sure we have many of you who are working in small communities. You're here representing our Main Street communities, our small communities, and what I'm talking about may seem urban in nature, but this is also about small communities too. So in fact, 40% of rural people surveyed see housing affordability as a major problem. 43% of suburban communities see it in the same way, and 63% in urban communities. So historic preservation has a tremendous opportunity to help people by providing affordable housing. We know how to do this, converting, adaptive reusing places. We do this all the time. This is one example in Illinois, in Paris, Illinois, which is about 6,000 people. It's a pretty small community. And the local high school was abandoned. A new high school was built in a cornfield. I'm sure many of you experienced that. They abandoned the high school. I'm thinking of Casson School, for example, which was a long-time project of ours. And this was turned into affordable senior rental housing. And one of the great stories here with the Tiger Senior part is the Tigers were their mascot, by the way, is that many of the people living in the building actually went to high school there. And they love that they are in their old classrooms. So this is an award-winning project, just finding a way to provide affordability, also in a meaningful space that matters to people. Climate change. So, of course, by the way, 57% of people in this room have never experienced a climate that is not warming. The climate has been warming since 1976, since the bicentennial, every year on average, and I would say that a Gallup poll in 2021 found that over 60% of the United States had incredible concerns about climate change. That might be even more today after flooding, after fires in Maui, after seeing the devastation of the impacts on weather of climate change. But preservation, we have exempted ourselves from energy codes. So interestingly, because we're trying to save historic fabric, we have exempted ourselves from having to actually improve energy efficiency. So this is really controversial to talk about this because we've tried to save as much as we can. I don't think it has to be an either or. There are ways to incorporate energy efficient features like, for example, insulation, which you generally can't see. But then we have to get even far beyond that because preservation being a practice that is sustainable in most cases, we can do better. We can make our homes more energy efficient, make our buildings more energy energy efficient. Find ways to incorporate clean energy, like this home in Los Angeles in the Hancock Park neighborhood, which is a historic district. In California, they have a law where actually if you are incorporating solar panels, you can do that without review anywhere in the state. You can do it without historic review. You can just put solar panels on your home. And some people may say, oh, this is, I can see them. Yes, you can. Aren't we saying that historic properties can be a bastion of clean energy? That we can be part of the solution to climate change? We don't have to create a fiction that you're walking into 1880. We can never do that. So why don't we just be outright about why our historic buildings can be energy efficient too? And in fact, right now, 40% of all carbon emissions are coming from our built environment. We have 110 million existing buildings in this country. 2/3 of those are going to be in operation over the next 40 years. We have a problem we need to solve. And we need to be more creative and flexible in how we do that. Additionally, that's an opportunity to create far more jobs in preservation as well. If we're thinking about energy efficiency, we have a job to do to create more jobs. And creating a more relevant preservation movement, by the way, does that, because when more people are doing preservation work, we create more jobs for people. And you might say, don't we have enough jobs? No, we don't. We have 63 existing historic preservation degree programs across the country with about 2,200 students. Last time we looked at PreserveNet, how many jobs were available in preservation? 50? 100? 2,200 students are out there paying student loans, paying $60,000 to $100,000 to get a preservation degree, and they come out and there's no job for them. Now you might say, we're looking for people. I'm sure Amy's like, we're looking for people at SHPO offices. So there are jobs out there, but I want to say we don't have enough to accommodate the students. They come out with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans, and even when they get a job, we're not paying enough for them to pay their student loans. We don't have usually benefits that are going to compete with others, so we just burn people out. So in fact, 50% of the nonprofit industry states that they're burned out right now. You don't have to raise hands, but I'm about there. And then 65% of the public sector reports being burned out. So just to say, this is a serious crisis that we need to support people in preservation. Making it more relevant would do that. If you see more people who believe in your work, you don't have to fight so hard for this, we wouldn't be as burned out in this either. So we also have to create more construction jobs. Right now, 40% of the journey people, so people in higher levels of the trades, are going to retire in the next 9 years. So we're going to lose 40% of our construction workers. Already 89%, the Associated General Contractors said 89% of the time they're not able to find enough construction workers. So if we want to do more of this work, there's not going to be anybody to do it if we don't also make it easier for people to enter the trades. This is a program, Chicago Women in Trades, that focuses on bringing women into the trades and making it possible for them to get the support that they need to find jobs. And I would just say we have a lot of work to do to make construction more celebrated, because right now it's still seen as dirty work. So just think about how to celebrate your trades workers too in your awards programs and grants and articles. Name the people doing the work, not just the architect, maybe the engineer, but who's the contractor? Who are the tradespeople doing this? All right, health. This is my connection here. I put in a Minnesota reference. Anybody know this building? I put this in because I spent a lot of time in the Minnesota State Capitol. That was one of my many jobs. While I was interning at SHPO office, I was also a tour guide at the Minnesota State Capitol. So I'm going to relate this to storytelling as well. But first, that there's been science that has been done to connect historic places to people's mental and physical health. We really don't talk about that. That actually people's connection to place has physical and mental well-being aspects of this at a community level and an individual level. This is one. There's a new science of biophilia, and biophilia is people's natural tendency to feel comfort when they're in nature. Who takes walks in the woods? You know, who goes out skiing? You know, when you're out in nature, Minnesota has a corner on this, so I knew you would all get this. You can't find nature in Chicago very easily. You know, it's all cordoned off in a park preserve, but here you can find it everywhere. We feel a natural calming tendency when we're in nature. And interestingly, the science shows that when people are near even natural forms, natural elements, like the column capitals here, the acanthus leaves, that we have the same calming effect on our physical psyche. It's interesting as that science is developing. But additionally, beyond that, there's something called solastalgia as well. So I just want to say preservation is connected on both sides. There's a calming feeling, but then when we lose a place, there's also a feeling of anxiety, trauma, depression. This is what happened during urban renewal, when entire communities were torn apart by the highways, by creating new buildings and entire campuses. Solastalgia was created as a new term, but you might know it as root shock as well, by Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who wrote a great book about this a number of years ago. When we are distanced from the places that we care about, that we love, that are about our community, we actually suffer physical ramifications that actually we transfer down in generations through our DNA to our children. So places have value beyond just the bricks and mortar. They have mental and physical health impacts, and positive and possibly negative when we lose them. We need to talk about that. Storytelling as well. I mean, I was a storyteller at the Minnesota State Capitol. I told them all about the wonderful marble, and those kids probably thought, how boring is that? Because, the storytelling we do is we talk about architect Cass Gilbert, 1893. They have no context for what that means. They're 9. They have no idea. What does that mean? That's the way preservationists tend to tell stories, is that we give the date of construction, maybe the architect, and we don't actually connect it to people's, the common stories that we share. So I just want to encourage you to think about, how do we lead out to tell stories about places? This is one that is so good. I would encourage you to look up the Project XB Museum, and it is a museum in El Paso, Illinois, population 2,000, and what they found, the owner of a building in their main street found that the building housed a barber shop by this gentleman, David Strother. And they learned that David Strother was the first African-American person to vote in Illinois after the passage of the 15th Amendment. So they turned this into a museum not only about David Strother, though, it's about the 15th Amendment and the importance of voting rights. So they tell the story of how Native Americans could not vote until the 1960s, about the LGBTQ community and how they've been disenfranchised. So they're so wonderful storytellers. It's not about the building, it's not about the date of construction, it's about what this community did and what this law did for David Strother and others. So check them out, wonderful storytellers, engaging, relevant people, because we all want the right to decide our democracy. And finally, fundraising. So you might say this, is talking about this work going to distance ourselves from long-standing donors, if you're in a nonprofit, or long-standing political support? Yes, it may make people uncomfortable. So as we've talked about relevance, as we talked about inclusive modeling, creating a just preservation organization, a just movement, an equitable movement, we've lost donors in that process who don't see themselves any longer in our work. And that may be the consequence, because we're actually opening opportunities for others to feel welcome in this space, and that's more important to us. So I just put this up because you might say, that this is just so difficult. But I want to say it's not. It's not that difficult when you really walk the walk and you talk the talk, or walk the talk. So here's our annual Preservation Forward event. It is the annual event where we recognize people who are moving preservation forward. It brings 900 people to the table. 900 people come out for this event to learn about preservation and how it's moving forward. I just want to say, if some people say young people don't care about preservation, yes they do. You just need to make it fun, right? Or interesting, or relevant, or have agency to decide what they're going to do in preservation. So it is possible. And additionally, when we raise funds, we give those funds back out to others, because we see fundraising that is values-based, the ability to authentically give to others, because we see fundraising as an abundance environment. That is also part of being relevant too, is making sure others have the resources, the tools that they need to raise funds, so that we're not a gatekeeper to those funds as well. So this is just, we have a great program for small communities in Southern Illinois. The most income income under-resourced area in our entire state is Southern Illinois. And so we provide resources through our own fundraising to give out as grants. And we do that to individual property owners, not 501c3s only, because property owners need that money too. Just think of your Main Street commercial area. It's not just nonprofits that need funding help. So once again, here are those opportunity areas, and there's essays on this so you can read them more deeply. This is just a surface level approach, so I apologize, that's all we really have time for today. But I hope that one of these topics has resonated for you and that you'd like to learn more. There are people working on these things all across the country. In the publication that we're going to be putting forward in the next month to two, there is a resource list that is about 40 pages long of people who are doing model programs, versions of this. I mean, new preservation has been raised by Rethos, for example, and that's talking about a just preservation movement. It's talking about the culture of preciousness. I think new history is talking differently about how to do development work, for example. So in Minnesota, there are examples of this as well. The seed that I wanted to plant in the last few minutes that we have is just even thinking differently about how people connect to place. So the more that we've had the opportunity to study this topic, it becomes clearer and clearer that places are about people's identity. So it's not just our connection with the bricks and mortar, it's that this is a place of our memory, it's a place of family, of community, of a story, of history, of our values. We save what we value. So think about that you don't have a right to a place that is part of your identity. Somebody else owns it. And in the US, the person who physically owns, has the title to a property, is the one who gets to decide what happens to it. And that's part of why preservation exists, is that we're trying to save places that perhaps the people who care about it don't own. So that's already within our DNA, is that we are trying to entice people, convince them that saving places is important, even when that story may not connect to them. They just may own it as a title. There's an example here of some work in this area about the right to place, including how to show that preservation, that historic places are a civil right. This is the 10th Street Historic District in Dallas, Texas, and it was one of the first freedmen towns. If you don't know, freedmen towns were created by former enslaved peoples so that they had a safe place to live, an environment where they could thrive and have businesses. This in Dallas, Texas was a thriving community. It has pretty small housing, and the city of Dallas put forward an ordinance that there was no review that was necessary for blighted properties under 3,000 square feet. That was a majority of all the housing in the 10th Street Historic District, so it didn't have to go through historic review. So the community brought forward a lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act that actually the right to place is a civil right. And they lost the case, but I don't think that's the end of the discussion about how preservation is actually a civil right as well. A right to place is something that should be enshrined in our work. Because by the way, it is a human right that is enshrined in international law. We just don't recognize it in the United States under international law. Furthermore, there's one other, getting a little bit out there, but I want you to give me a moment, that preservation may be a part of what's called the environmental right to personhood. So you may have heard of the case of Monoman versus the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, where Monoman, wild rice, in this particular area, the White Earth Reservation, is White Earth, the wild rice is suing the state as an entity because it has the right to live. And the pipeline that was proposed for next door to the rice fields could inhibit, could prevent its long-term survival. So that was an effort by lawyers at White Earth to actually give wild rice environmental personhood so that it could sue. So that was still going through tribal court. It's gone back and forth, and so far I think it was overruled by the appeals court and tribal court, but this is happening all across the country. Salmon in Seattle have the right of personhood. Rivers have the right of personhood. The Ganges has the right of personhood to basically say, I can thrive, I can survive. One is to say that if a place is about people's identity and culture and history and story, does it have the same right? Is there the possibility that it could have a right or something? That is way out there in legal terms, but if there are any burgeoning lawyers in here who want to study that, there you go, there's your dissertation. So finally, I hope something in here has caused you to think a little bit more about some area of relevance and preservation. Maybe we missed some areas of discussion, but I hope that you have something in there where you say, I really want to take a step to think about how to make preservation more relevant to my community, to the people that I'm working with, that I'm consulting with, that I'm designing for, that I'm reviewing their properties. And so I asked, what are you willing to do? So I ask you to think about that during this conference. What is an action you're willing to take within the next year, the next 5 years, that is going to help to enhance relevance for preservation in Minnesota so that 50 years from now, we can continue to serve the people who need these resources and tools. And by that time, they will be more accessible, more applicable, easier to find, more relevant to people, even outside of the regulatory tools like the National Register. This is all going to be published in this guidebook, which is coming out again in hopefully November, and it is a resource that has a quick reference guide, it has an executive summary, it has things that you can hand out to city councils, essays that go more into depth in these topics, as well as resource lists, and an entire list of ideas that's about 500 ideas long. So you can choose from any one of those and take action. You don't need to think about it, you just can go right through that list and choose something that you feel is doable from your perspective. If each one of us takes an action, we will move preservation forward. We don't have to do it in the same way, but what's important is that we take steps to move it forward. So at this time, we have about 8 minutes for your question and answer, and so grateful to have had this time with you. Thank you for welcoming me back. Are there any questions out there that you would like to ask? No one wants to be the first one. Are there any questions? I put out, oftentimes I get one for this culture of preciousness and the impact that may have publishing that, or ideas about creating an inclusive movement. So once again, I'll just put out there, any questions? Right, sir, and I'll get back there in a moment. Oh, hi, Ben. So, yes, sir.
How much pushback are you getting from the development community, especially in places like the state of Chicago?
So,
City like Chicago.
Sure. So the question was, how much pushback are we getting from the development community within the city of Chicago, or as well as the city of Chicago? As well as the city government, okay. Interestingly, the conversations that we've had about this work with the development community is that they're quite excited about it. And here is why, because making it easier to use some of our regulatory and incentives-based tools is actually going to help them do their work faster. So if we can find ways to identify what is most important in the work, so is it the material or is it the story? Is it climate change or is it the material? You know, how are we making it easier for them to find a reuse for buildings? They're excited about that. So they're, I would say, on board generally for anything that's going to find a way to allow a reuse to go forward. And make that easier. The city of Chicago, I think they have some of the same concerns that we've heard from our other regulatory friends, our partners across the country, is that our regulatory partners, notwithstanding those in the room, feel beat up in this process. I would say the National Park Service and those that I've spoken with think they're being attacked, that the work that they're doing is not appreciated. So it's so important to talk about that. We've done this work in the way we've been taught. We were taught how to do this work and how to review, and we followed that guidance and tried to do things in a way that has due process, that is fair. And so now having discussions about unmaking this or dismantling this is causing a question about what is my job going to be like? How would I do this? How would we administer a tax credit program if there's no Secretary of the Interior standards or the criteria are gone? What does that mean for the National Register? And because we don't have any answers or definitive answers, that it's causing, I think, a lot of anxiety in our regulatory environment and people feeling like they're not appreciated as well. So it's important to say that we appreciate the people doing the work. This is not easy work as well. But I hope that we can keep an open mind and keep moving forward together. Does that answer the question, sir? Okay, thank you for that. All right, in the back, there was a question? Yes?
I have a question about designation of property. You mentioned that if the property was rejected for designation, should we go back and try and redesignate that based on the person that lived in the house rather than the structure itself?
Thank you. So what I heard you ask, sir, is that what I was saying was that a property that has been denied for listing in the National Register should we or could we go back multiple times based on the layers of history that we have? Could we go back? Is that what you're asking? Okay. So in the case of the Sheldon Peck House, that was the first one, the abolitionist history on the Network to Freedom as well, is that in this particular case with our State Historic Preservation Office, they oftentimes won't automatically deny that something is eligible. That's not their job, actually. That's the National Park Service that makes the final decision. But in this particular case, it won't be sent to our review committee. So here it's the review board, there it's the Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Committee that reviews things to send it on to the Park Service. We never get it to the Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Council to even discuss it if the staff is not feeling it's going to be successful. Some of our question is just let it go. let it have its day to be heard. But it keeps coming back with comments on how to improve, and at some point you can't write any more about something. It just is or it isn't. So that's some of the experiences that we've had in Illinois. It is different across every state, though, and that is some of the frustration, is that there's not necessarily a consistency. I was having a conversation, though, with Catherine about that having a sort of states' rights approach to administer the register in a state is actually beneficial. I could see that, and this is where it gets very complex, so I understand. Does that answer the question, sir? Okay. Are there other questions? Yes, thank you.
You show the culture of preciousness and the house that was not admitted because it had vinyl siding. How do you deal with making the building accessible or accessibility issues?
So the question was, in the example that you referenced, thank you, was the Bagley house, which has the alternative siding on the exterior. In the culture of preciousness label, if we're going to use that, what does that mean for accessibility and the integration of accessible features? So I did not mention that, but I'm so glad that you brought it up, because I personally think that accessibility is just as important to ensure anybody can access a historic building. Everyone has a right to that place, to that history, and that instead of tucking it around the back or thinking about it as an appendage, that just put it there so that everybody can find it. And I'm sure we can see that it's not original to the building, but we're making places accessible to people, which is going to help them to be more relevant. So I really think we need to shift how we think about accessibility in historic places and to make them as accessible as possible. In the same way as solar panels, like put it out there. Just make sure that people can access it, because I think it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do, and it's also saying historic places are welcome. It's a welcoming space. That's just my personal opinion. Did that answer your question?
It did. I mean, you get like points off for features like that currently.
Do you get points off? Is that what
when you're submitting a building for being on the register?
The National Register. I would say this is so there. The question was, we sort of get dinged if there's a accessibility in the front. I think that's really up to the reviewers to decide if they would see it as something that was considered an integrity question. There's also reversibility. So I just want to say, solar panels are reversible. We can take them back off and restore the roof. Many accessibility features, you could probably restore them back if it was ever needed to. But it's the bigger picture, I think, is how do we make places welcoming to all? Probably one time for, is there one more question? Carolyn.
It's fine. Fabulous presentation. Thank you. Is there wiggle room within the Secretary of Interior standards for broader interpretation? And if not, how can the standards be changed?
The million-dollar question at the very end, Carolyn Sundquist, thank you. The question was, is there wiggle room in the Secretary of the Interior standards to allow for flexibility? And I would say that within the National Register of Historic Places, the National Historic Preservation Act, excuse me, there's the criteria for listing, and then there's the Secretary of the Interior standards. We confuse them when sometimes people talk about them. So the Secretary of the Interior standards is about how to adapt buildings, or how to restore buildings, or how to conserve buildings. There's different standards for those. And actually there's a great deal of flexibility in that. There absolutely is an ability to think about the totality of a place, to use the different standards as need be to accommodate what is needed. It is really up to the reviewer, and that is sometimes the question, because our local reviewers can be really flexible about things. They're oftentimes trying to get to yes, trying to help someone. I think about Charlie Nelson, if everybody remembers Charlie Nelson. He was at the SHPO office, by the way, trying to get people to find a way to help people get to yes. It may start here and then it gets to the National Park Service and it becomes no. So that is sometimes the challenge, is that the local reviewers will try to help with a tax credit project, for example, and then the Park Service, when it gets to that level, it changes. And that's very frustrating for people. But ultimately, or I should say inherently, it is flexible. There was just an effort by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is the federal government agency that watches the federal government agencies for preservation, to ask for opinions about the Secretary of the Interior standards. And I know they're just going to be publishing the letters that came in from people. So that would be really interesting for you all to take a look at what others are saying about the Secretary of the Interior standards.